I was only 8, but I can still remember that day as if it were yesterday. The day when the birds in our quiet town in Shropshire went from being ordinary creatures of nature to something much more sinister. In a bizarre sort of way, it seemed fitting that we'd later come to call them the Quakers, a strange nod to a darker reality than we'd ever faced before. It was a typical Thursday afternoon, and the school had just let out. My younger sister Faye and I were strolling back home as we usually did. Faye was excitedly chatting about her latest creation from art class, and I, in my role as a dutiful older brother, was half listening, half focused on the path ahead. That's when we heard it. A shrill, eerie cawing that seemed to surround us from all directions. Glancing upwards, I saw a murder of crows circling ominously against the sky. Their dark silhouettes were stark against the fading daylight, making them resemble eerie, ominous specters. A chill ran down my spine, a gut feeling telling me something was amiss. Looking at Faye, I saw she had fallen silent and was staring at the birds, her small face tinged with unease. Instinctively, I reached for her hand, pulling her closer to me, just as the first crow swooped down. The attack was so swift, I barely had time to react. The crow swooped, talons bared, straight at Faye. I pushed her aside and swung my school bag at the bird, causing it to veer off its course. Before I could breathe a sigh of relief, more crows began to dive down at us, cawing and flapping their wings menacingly. We ran, all the way home, crows hot on our heels. Mom was shocked when she saw us, scratched, panting, and terrified. But there was no time for explanations. Later, while Dad was tending to his roses in the garden, the Quakers came for him. Faye and I watched in horror from the window as he was swarmed. The birds were everywhere, cawing and pecking, their beady eyes filled with a chilling madness. Using the hose, I scared them off long enough for Dad to escape into the house. That day, our quiet town in Shropshire was transformed into a living nightmare. We were under siege by creatures we had once seen as harmless parts of nature. These weren't just birds anymore. They were the Quakers, and they had gone psycho mode on us. After that day, our once peaceful town was on high alert. There were whispered conversations among adults and urgent town meetings. Everyone was terrified, confused, wondering how something so surreal could be happening in our quiet corner of Shropshire. Faye and I weren't allowed to walk to school anymore. Mom drove us there and back. Everyone stayed indoors as much as possible, peering nervously out of their windows at the mass of black feathers circling ominously overhead. But the Quakers didn't just stay content with our fear. They seemed to grow bolder. One day, they swooped down on the local butcher, causing a mass panic. On another, they managed to break a few windows of the town library. It was as if they were not just birds anymore, but vengeful creatures on a mission. Dad tried to fight them off as best he could. He began carrying a large umbrella with him whenever he went into the garden, using it as a makeshift shield. But they were persistent, diving at him with an unrelenting ferocity that was terrifying to watch. One evening, after an unusually quiet day, I was sitting in my room when I heard a sharp, frantic cawing. Rushing to the window, I saw them, hundreds of them, descending onto our house. I ran down the stairs, shouting for my family. Mum, Faye, and I huddled in the living room while Dad tried to fend them off with his umbrella. But there were too many. The cawing became a deafening roar as the Quakers hurled themselves at our windows, at the doors, trying to get in. Then, silence. The sudden absence of sound was more terrifying than the noise had been. Cautiously, Dad went to the door and opened it. The garden was empty. The Quakers were gone, as suddenly as they had come. The following days were filled with unease. The Quakers had disappeared entirely, leaving our town in a state of bewildered relief. Things slowly started to return to normal. Faye and I started walking to school again. Dad tended to his rose garden without the fear of attack, and Mom started to smile more. But the memory of the Quakers, their sudden attack and abrupt disappearance, still hangs over our town like a dark cloud. Every time I see a bird, I can't help but flinch, remembering the terror of those days when the Quakers went psycho mode on us. We might have survived, but we'll never forget. I grew up in rural Kentucky, in a house that had been in my family for generations. It was old and creaky, and at night, it came alive with strange noises. Of course, we attributed it to the house settling or the wind. But what happened during the long summer of 2022 changed that perception forever. I was home from college for the summer break. My bedroom was upstairs, where the heat was stifling, but it was my space. The strange noises started the first night I was back. A subtle scratching sound behind the walls, almost like a mouse, yet somehow different. Too consistent, too rhythmic. At first, I thought nothing of it. We'd always had critters, and I'd grown used to their noises. But as nights turned into weeks, the sounds grew more insistent, more desperate. One night, as I lay awake, straining my ears to make out the sound, it changed. From scratching to thumping, rhythmic and unceasing. I felt a chill run down my spine, my heart beating in sync with the unknown force behind the wall. I gathered my courage and pressed my ear to the wall, trying to identify the source. The wall was oddly cold, and as I listened, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A low, moaning sound, almost like a whimper. That's when the terror set in. This wasn't an animal. It was something else, something inhuman. I told my parents, but they brushed it off as my wild imagination. However, the noises continued, growing louder each night. I could barely sleep, the thumping and whimpering echoing in my mind even when the house was quiet. Soon I began to feel a strange presence, a heaviness in the room, an unseen pair of eyes always watching. Desperate for answers, I decided to investigate. I found an old blueprint of the house in the attic. It revealed a hidden room, right behind my bedroom wall. It had been sealed off years ago. Why? No one seemed to know. Equipped with a hammer and driven by both fear and curiosity, I broke through the wall one sweltering afternoon. Dust flew everywhere, and when it settled, I found myself staring at a small, musty room. It was empty except for a wooden chair facing a dark, stained wall. Overwhelmed by a sense of dread, I stepped into the room. Suddenly, the temperature dropped, my breath forming small clouds in the stifling summer heat. I felt a gust of wind, and the door behind me slammed shut. In the eerie silence that followed, I heard it again, the thumping, the scratching, the whimpering. Only now, it was all around me, closing in. It was deafening, and I clapped my hands over my ears, dropping to my knees. A voice echoed in the room, a voice full of sorrow and pain, whispering my name. I turned around and found myself looking into the hollow eyes of a ghostly figure. It was thin and ragged, its face a mask of eternal torment. It reached out to me, mouthing a silent plea before disappearing into the darkness. I stumbled out of the room, breathless and terrified. My parents found me on the floor, white as a sheet and shaking. After that, the strange noises stopped. The house was quiet, the presence gone. We sealed the room again, and I moved to the guest bedroom downstairs. But the memory of that ghostly figure stayed with me, a chilling reminder of the summer of 2022 and the strange noises that came from the walls at night. Every old house has its secrets, but I learned the hard way that some secrets are better left undiscovered. I'll always wonder what happened in that sealed room, but I'm not sure I ever want to know the real story. The Kentucky ghost story, my scary story, is still a part of me, a chilling piece of my past I can never forget. The day I encountered the Slender Man, I was 16. At the time, I lived in a small town, nestled between vast stretches of dense forests in Oregon. We heard all kinds of tales about the woods, but the Slender Man was one tale that always sent shivers down my spine. He was said to be tall, unusually thin, faceless, and always dressed in a black suit. That fateful day in August, I had a huge fight with my mom. Angry and upset, I took off towards the woods on my bike, seeking solace in the serene, untouched wilderness. Little did I know, I was venturing into a day of terror. The sun was just setting as I parked my bike at the edge of the forest, and I began walking deeper into the trees. My anger gradually dissipated, replaced by the soothing symphony of crickets and the rustling leaves in the breeze. I ventured further in, as darkness started to cloak the sky. I had a flashlight, so I wasn't particularly worried. I was a good mile into the woods when the beam of my flashlight flickered and dimmed. Cursing under my breath, I smacked it against my palm. The light stuttered back to life, just in time for me to spot an unnaturally tall figure standing amidst the trees. A chill ran down my spine. The figure was thin, suited, and seemingly faceless. My heart pounded against my ribs, remembering the tales of the Slender Man. I tried to dismiss my fear as paranoia, but the figure stood there, eerily motionless. With trembling hands, I shone my light at it again, hoping it was just a trick of the shadows. But no, it was still there. Summoning all my courage, I decided to get a closer look, praying it was just a tree or an oddly shaped rock formation. As I approached, the figure seemed to grow taller, looming over me. I stopped in my tracks. Fear rooted me to the spot. Suddenly, I felt a gust of cold wind whip past me, causing me to shiver. The figure was no longer where I had seen it last. Panic washed over me. I turned around to sprint back to my bike, but my flashlight flickered and died. I stood in utter darkness, heart hammering in my chest, trying to listen for any sound apart from my own terrified breathing. Every creak of a branch, every rustle of leaves sounded ominous. I started walking in the direction I thought my bike was, trying to make as little noise as possible. After what seemed like forever, the moonlight broke through the tree canopy, lighting up the path just enough for me to spot my bike. I ran towards it. But as I was just a few feet away, there he was again, the Slender Man. He was closer now, standing between me and my bike. Tears welled up in my eyes. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to scream or run. Suddenly, the Slender Man moved, startling me. He took one long, unnatural stride towards me. I felt a scream tear through my throat as I turned and bolted in the opposite direction. Branches whipped my face as I ran blindly, the Slender Man's image etched into my mind. Somehow, I found a small clearing bathed in moonlight. I collapsed there, gasping for air. But when I turned to look back, he was gone. I stayed in the clearing until the first light of dawn, too scared to move. The walk back home was a blur. I never told anyone about what happened. I knew they wouldn't believe me. They would think it was just a trick of the light or my imagination running wild. But I know what I saw, and it haunts me to this day. I still have nightmares about that night. Ever since then, I steer clear of the woods. The terror of that night remains with me, a harsh reminder of the day Slender Man tried to get me. Every now and then, I can't help but wonder if he's still out there, waiting in the forest, watching. When you live in a small town, there's a certain comfort in routine. You know the comings and goings of the place as if it's a living, breathing entity. I lived in such a town, Coburn, population 326. And like clockwork, every day at 7 p.m., the static crackle of the public announcement system would echo throughout the sleepy streets. Attention. Curfew begins in 5 minutes. Please head to your home now. No one questioned it. It was a quirk of our town. Just as no one questioned why old Mrs. Henderson painted her picket fence every other Tuesday, or why Mr. Calloway, the barber, had kept the same broken clock on his wall for 30 years. It was just the way it was. It was late one summer evening, and I was just closing up the local diner where I worked, serving up hot coffee and pie to our town's inhabitants. The sun was setting, painting the sky with streaks of pink and orange, and I was lost in the beauty of it when the familiar announcement startled me. Attention. Curfew begins in 5 minutes. Please head to your home now. Glancing at my wristwatch, I felt a surge of panic. 6:55 p.m. I quickly locked up the diner and started to make my way home, my heart pounding with each step. It wasn't far, but the curfew was something we all took seriously. As I reached the halfway point, a sudden breeze sent a chill down my spine. The beautiful summer evening had taken on a sinister edge. The once colorful horizon was now a dark purple, and an uncomfortable silence had fallen over the town. The lights in every house were out, curtains drawn. Even Mr. Calloway's barbershop was swallowed in darkness, the usually inviting warm glow extinguished. It felt as though the town was holding its breath, waiting. I quickened my pace, the sound of my footsteps uncomfortably loud in the silence. I passed by Mrs. Henderson's house, her freshly painted fence gleaming white in the fading light, and then the town hall, its tall clock tower ominously overlooking the empty streets. Just as I turned the corner onto my street, a sudden shuffling sound stopped me in my tracks. It was quiet, almost drowned out by the pounding of my heart, but unmistakable. The rustling seemed to be coming from the alleyway a few houses down. Fear gripped me as I froze, straining my ears to decipher the source of the sound. I was contemplating whether to run or hide when a dark figure emerged from the alleyway, startling me. As it stepped into the dim light of the street lamp, my blood ran cold. It was Billy, the town's local drifter. His clothes were disheveled, and his usually warm eyes were wide with terror. He was clutching a dirty, ripped sack tightly, his knuckles white. "Billy," I whispered, stepping closer. "What's wrong? Are you okay?" But he didn't answer. Instead, he just stared at me, his chest heaving. Then, with trembling hands, he offered me the sack. I hesitated before taking it, the weight of it surprising me. Inside were dozens of hastily scribbled notes, their edges crumpled and stained. The frantic handwriting was Billy's. I was sure of it. "Billy, what is all this?" I asked, panic rising in my voice. But he had already turned and disappeared back into the shadows of the alleyway. With a sinking feeling in my gut, I stumbled home, the sack clutched tightly in my hand. My house was dark and silent, just like the others. I closed the door behind me, my heart pounding as I began to sift through Billy's notes. Each one was more chilling than the last. They were filled with desperate warnings, frantic scribbles about the curfew, about what happens in the town after dark. Each note was a plea for help, a plea for someone to listen, to understand. I felt sick as the reality of Billy's notes sank in. All those years, the daily curfew, the town's silence, we had grown used to it, accepted it without question. But now, I sat there in the dark, the horror of Billy's notes sinking in, when a sudden knock echoed through the house. I froze, the sound jolting me from my thoughts. Who would be out after curfew? With each second that passed, the knocks grew louder, more desperate. I forced myself to move, making my way to the front door with bated breath. As I peered through the peephole, my blood ran cold. There, standing on my porch, was every single resident of Coburn. Their faces were blank, their eyes empty, and as I watched in growing horror, they began to speak in unison. "Curfew begins now. It is time." In that moment, I understood the true horror of our town's curfew, the sinister secret that we had all blindly accepted. Billy had tried to warn us, tried to open our eyes, but it was too late. As I backed away from the door, my heart pounding in my chest, one thought echoed in my mind. What happens in Coburn after dark? But then again, maybe some things are better left unknown. The pounding at the door became frantic, their voices raised in an eerie chant that echoed through the silent house. I fell to the floor, the sack of Billy's warnings scattered around me. The nightmare of our town was real, and it was only just beginning. The last thing I remember before darkness enveloped me was the haunting echo of the public announcement system. "Attention. Curfew begins in 5 minutes. Please head to your home now." It was no longer a warning, but a threat.